Okay, so we're recording now.
Yes.
And okay, so I'm gonna get started. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Great.
Okay, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us. We're just gonna wait a couple of seconds just so we can let everyone get settled in. Okay, so today I am going to be talking about veganism, sustainable development, and okay, so to start, I'm just going to give a little bit of background about me and how I came into ethical veganism and consistent anti-oppression. So I am originally from Ghana, which is in West Africa. I grew up in Japan and experienced both oppression and privileges. So I'm a woman, I'm Black, I'm from a developing country, which means that, you know, my nationality provides a lot of obstacles for me compared to someone who is from the global North. But at the same time, I also am middle class. I'm highly educated. And I think that just being born to who you were born to is also a privilege. I just happened to really valued education, so they spent money on educating both me and my sister. And there are some people who, whether it's because they didn't have the means or maybe because education's not that important in their families, they don't have the same opportunities that I have had and continue to have. So I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the concept of intersectionality, which was I have a slightly more contemporary definition, which was added to Merriam-Webster last year, and that is intersectionality is the complex, cumulative manner in which the effects of different forms of discrimination combine, overlap, or intersect. So obviously, I benefits from overlapping forms of oppression, but I also have overlapping forms of privilege, like I mentioned, being educated, middle class, being able-bodied, being cisgender, etc. And I realized that pretty early on that I never wanted to deliberately contribute to the oppression of other people. Like really understanding that I also didn't have the right to contribute to the oppression of animals. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainable development. Sustainable development, I took this definition off of Wikipedia. Basically, it is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. So basically, this is referring to social, economic, and environmental development that is sustainable, which means that it is not harming anyone. And really, the sustainable portion of it has started to increasingly mean the environmental effects of, for example, climate change or environmental degradation from other activities. And since I work in sustainable development, I realized that firstly, that I didn't want to contribute to climate change, which disproportionately affects people in the global south. And not only does it disproportionately affect them, they also contribute to it. That's really the reason I came into veganism. But the longer I was in it, the more I started to realize that I also, if I wanted to be against oppression, I needed to be consistent. So I'm also just going to talk a little bit more about sustainable development. So like I mentioned in my day job, so this is expertise that I've learned from my job and my schooling. So in 2015, the United Nations member states adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. which is referred to as the SDGs. This was adopted after the expiration of the millennium from 2000 to 2015. To put it simply, it is a plan for people, planet, and prosperity. Sorry. So what that basically means is that we want to make sure that everyone has equal opportunities, everyone has a decent standard of living, and that we do this in a way that it is whether that's in water. The SDGs consist of 17 different goals, and there are also several hundred targets that correspond to each of these goals. They are intersecting and holistic. So, for example, principle of the SDGs is to end poverty in all of its forms everywhere. Goal 5 is to empower all women and girls and achieve gender equality. Even though these are two separate goals, obviously there are lots of interconnections between them because poverty is highly feminized. That they have a very binary understanding of gender. And some people argue that, well, equality for all human beings means equality for all human beings, but just in the same way that, you know, girls and women are explicitly mentioned and people of racial and ethnic minorities are mentioned, I also think that people who fall outside the spectrum of male, female, or who fall anywhere along the spectrum need to be. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about the goals themselves. So just a quick overview. These are the 17 goals. Number 1, no poverty. Number 2, zero hunger. 3, good health and well-being. 4, quality education. 5, gender equality. 6, 7, affordable and clean energy. 8, decent work and economic growth. 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. 10, reduced inequalities. 11, sustainable cities and communities. 12, responsible consumption and production. 13, climate change. 14, life below water. 15, life on land. 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And 7, partnerships for the goals. And voila, you are now all experts in the SDGs. But seriously, they're the ones that I think relate pretty strongly to anti-oppression, consistent anti-oppression, veganism, and ethnic equality, are clean water and sanitation, decent work and economic growth, reduced inequalities, climate change, responsible consumption and production, life on land, and peace, justice, and strong institutions. That are these 4. So the first one that I want to talk about is goal 8, decent work and economic growth. So the animal agriculture industry, whether that is fishing or concentrated animal feeding operations, which are more commonly known as factory farms, leather tanning sites, and slaughterhouses, are working. But for example, a lot of the increasing demand for seafood in the West has led to a lot of people being enslaved on Thai fishing boats. And a lot of these people are those who are already oppressed. They may include poor people from Thailand or refugees escaping Myanmar. Slaughterhouses and on fishing boats and tanning sites, etc., are obviously indecent for both the non-human animals and for the workers. And this work is disproportionately done by people of color all around the world. Even in developing countries, the people who take on these jobs even in developed countries, the people who tend to take on these jobs tend to color. And of course, as we know, there are systemic reasons for people being poor. It's not a failure of character. It's not a choice to be poor. There are systemic reasons, such as capitalism, such as institutional discrimination, why people are poor. However, even though we tend to think of factory farms as being in the global north, they're increasingly developing and emerging economies, like in the Philippines, Brazil, and South Africa. So conditions in the animal agriculture are oppressive to both animals and to human beings. And I think as people of color, it's sort of our responsibility to really assess what the choices we're making mean. The next goal I want to talk about is goal 10, which is reduce inequalities. This goal actually is talking about reducing inequalities both within and between countries. So poor countries, which are disproportionate by people of color, well, sorry, not populated, but poor countries are populated largely by people of color. And these countries disproportionately bear the brunt of indecent work. And much of it takes place in animal agriculture. So firstly, creating or means making sure that economies are sustainable, both socially and environmentally, for everyone. So instead of shipping out indecent work to developing countries, companies in the global north first need to make sure that the working conditions in their countries are decent for everyone, people of color and people of the making sure that the inequalities between countries disappear means that we need to make sure that things like structural adjustment and high interest loans from international finance institutions are no longer parts of our economy going forward, because really this has a large role in perpetuating inequalities between countries. The next goal that I want to talk about is responsible production and consumption. So mass scale animal agriculture is, by default, irresponsible production. It is environmentally unsustainable. And animals who are being exploited in these types of facilities, but also to the people who have to do this work. This work has serious risks physically, as well as causing serious mental illness in people who have to do this type of dangerous and dangerous and so for most people, there is no need, if we were to imagine that we were in a world where all the food that is produced on Earth is equitably distributed, there isn't any need to participate in mass scale animal agriculture. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in, but I think we as individuals who have privilege have a bit of a responsibility to think about what are to other people around the world and to animals around the world. Finally, before I get to that, basically, I want to say that I hope that I demonstrated that the SDGs are intersecting and the connection in between veganism and consistent. And I just wanted to point out that Black and brown people, not only, but especially in the global South, are being exploited in order to exploit animals. So what a cycle. Like, there are those of us, the elite few, who get to, enjoy decent standards of living, look like us in other parts of the world, are being exploited. And not only are they being exploited, their exploitation is the means to another being's exploitation. I also want to point out that development does not necessarily mean the same thing in every single context. There's this report by Survival called Progress Can Kill. I Don't Want This Life. And it talks about how the development industry, really, because you can call it an industry, has really damaged a lot of indigenous people's way of life. I'm just going to read this quote. Industrialized societies subject tribal peoples to genocidal violence, slavery, and racism, so they can steal their lands, resources, and labor. These crimes are often carried out in the name of progress and development. And yet the notion of progress, which grew of age with colonialism, is hardly ever questioned. It is simply thought to be good for all. And the very irony of this is that it isn't necessarily good for all. For example, when you look at forest areas that are traditionally inhabited by indigenous peoples being logged, how can we argue that that is good for all? It's detrimental not only to the people who are living there, but also to the animals whose habitat you destroyed, all in the name of development. So I think that this is something that the development community really needs to reckon with as we push towards what I think is a noble goal of achieving decent standards of living and freedom for everybody. We also need to be mindful of the fact that context matters and history matters, and we can't do this in ways that are just perpetuating colonialism. So now I want to talk about what I think are the responsibilities of people who are invested in consistent anti-oppression. So on a personal level, I think that first we have to recognize our privilege. But I also think that recognizing our privilege is not really all that meaningful if we're not willing to advocate for surrendering our privilege. If you are privileged, that means that somebody else is underprivileged. And that doesn't mean that we're necessarily bad people for being born how we were born or having been given the opportunities that we were given. But if we know that people are being exploited in order for us to have those privileges, we need to understand that we need to give up those privileges. I also think on a personal level, for those who are able, going vegan is absolutely necessary, not only to save the lives of animals, but also to make sure that other people are not being exploited and that they have livelihoods that are not dangerous, that are decent, that are, that allow them to provide for their families. And I also think that we need to promote a circular economy. Even though this gets a little further away from the topic of veganism in and of itself, I think that the same dynamics that we see in factory farming are also visible in mass production of household goods and everything. It's people are being exploited to create these goods to feed, in a lot of the time, northern demand. So I think we have a responsibility to make sure that instead of the linear economy that we live in right now, in which human beings and non-human animals are exploited, we need to advocate for a circular economy. On an institutional level, I believe that countries in the global north have serious responsibilities as well if we want to achieve a world that is free of oppression. Firstly, I think that they owe reparations to former colonies. Although colonialism in name ended several hundred years ago, or 150 years ago or so, that doesn't mean that the effects of colonialism still aren't being felt. And they're being felt by actual people whose lives are a lot of the time in abject poverty. Now, reparations are not necessarily financial. It could mean helping these countries set up the same type of infrastructure that had been set up in the North by exploiting these countries. I also think that it is absolutely necessary for us to put into law equity and rights for all people and animals. There is already a wealth of international, regional, and domestic law that protects human rights and some laws that protect animal rights. But laws existing is one thing. We also need to make sure that these laws are implemented and that everyone has access to all of the targets and the 17 goals that I mentioned earlier. Now, I also think that going vegan on an individual level is not necessarily enough. I do think it is a responsibility. In an international community, individual countries that are willing to create a vegan society. And what I mean by that is create a society in which there is no factory farming, in which there are no tanning houses for leather, in which, birds are not being exploited for their down, etc. And this will also take a lot, I mentioned in the response. And finally, I think that a circular economy, these circular economies exist, but they exist on small scales. I think what we need to do is advocate for a circular economy on larger scales. And this could feed into veganism. For example, instead of creating, raising, for example, cows and perhaps we can reuse the already existing material that exists. And that way people don't have to do this terrible work of tanning, slaughtering animals in slaughterhouses, and animals who are alive do not have to lose their lives just for, human consumption. That is the end of my time for joining me. And please join us tomorrow when we'll be doing a live Q&A. Thank you. Stop recording.